Alrighty, so this story, again from my big book of modern fantasy, is called The Anything Box, as written by Zeena Henderson. I suppose it was about the second week of school that I noticed Sue Lin particularly. Of course, I noticed her name before and checked her out automatically for maturity and ability, and probable performance in the way most teachers do with their students during the first weeks of school. She had checked out mature and capable, and no worry as to performance. So I had pigeonholed her, setting aside for the moment the little nudge that said, "Too quiet," with my other no worries until the fluster and flurry of the first days had died down a little. I remember my noticing day. I had collapsed into my chair for a brief respite from the guiding hot little hands through the intricacies of keeping Crayola within reasonable bounds, and the room was full of a relaxed, happy hum of a pleased class as they worked away, not realizing that they were rubbing blue into their memories, as well onto their papers. I was meditating on how individual personalities were beginning to emerge among the 35 or so heterogeneous first graders I had, when I noticed Sue Lin, really noticed her for the first time. She had finished her paper, far ahead of the others as usual, and was sitting back at her table facing me. She had her thumbs touching in front of her on the table, and her fingers curving as though they held something between them, something large enough to keep her fingerprints apart, and angular enough to bend her fingers as if for corners. It was something pleasant that she held, pleasant and precious. You could tell that by the softness of her hold. She was leaning forward a little, her lower ribs pressed against the table. She was looking, completely absorbed, at the table. Her face was relaxed and happy. Her mouth curved in a tender half-smile as I watched. Her lashes lifted as she looked at me with a warm, share-the-pleasure look. Then her eyes blinked and the shutters came down inside them. Her hand flicked into the desk and out. She pressed her thumbs to her forefingers and rubbed them slowly together. Then she laid one hand over the other on the table and looked down at them with the air of complete denial and ignorance children can assume so devastatingly. The incident caught my fancy, and I began to notice Sue Lin. As I consciously watched her, I say that she spent most of her free time staring at the table between her hands, much too unobtrusively to catch my busy attention. She hurried through even the funnest of fun papers, and then lost herself in looking. When Davy pushed her down at recess, and blood streamed from her knee to her ankle, she took her bandages and her tear-smudged face to that comfort she had so readily, if you'll pardon the expression, at hand, and emerged minutes later, serene and dry-eyed. I think Davy pushed her down because of her looking. I know the day before he had come up to me, red-faced and squirming. "Teacher," he blurted, "she looks." "Who looks?" I asked absently, checking the vocabulary list in my book, wondering how on earth I missed "where," one of those annoying WH words that throw the children for a loss. Sue Lin. She looks and looks. At you? I asked. Well, he rubbed a forefinger below his nose, leaving a clean streak on his upper lip. Accepting the proffered Kleenex and putting it in his pocket. She looks at her desk and tells lies. She says she can see. Can see what? My curiosity pricked up its ears. Anything, said Davy. It's her anything box. She can see anything she wants to. Does it hurt you for her to look? Well, he squirmed, then he burst out. She says she saw me with the dog biting me because I took her pencil. She said. He stared pell-mell in a verbal retreat. She thinks I took her pencil. I only found... His eyes dropped. I'll give it back. I hope so, I smiled. If you don't want her to look at you, then don't do things like that. Darn girls, he muttered as he clomped back to his seat. So I think he pushed her down the next day to get back at her for the dog bite. Several times after that, I wandered to the back of the room, casually in her vicinity, but always she either saw or felt me coming, and the quick sketch of her hand to dispose the evidence. Only once I thought I caught a glimmer of something, but her thumb and forefinger brushed in the sunlight, and it must have been just that. Children don't retreat for no reason at all. And I thought Sue Lin didn't follow any overt pattern of withdrawal. I started to wonder about her. I watched her on the playground to see how she tracked there. It only confused me more. She had a very regular pattern. When the avalanche of children first descended at recess, she avalanched along with them, and nothing in the shrieking, running, dodging mass resolved itself into a withdrawal in Sue Lin. But after 10 minutes or so, she emerged from the crowd, tousle-haired and rosy-cheeked, smutched with dust, one shoelace dangling, and through some alchemy that I coveted for myself, she suddenly became untousled, undusty, and unsmutched. And then there she was, serene and composed, on the little narrow step at the side of the flight of stairs, just where they had disappeared into the base of the pseudo-Corinthian columns that graced our doors. And she cupped her hands, received whatever they received, and her absorption in what she saw became so complete that the bell came as a shock every time. And each time before she joined the rush to our door, her hand would sketch a gesture to her pocket, if she had one, or to the tiny ledge that extended between the hedge and the building. Apparently she always had to put the anything box away, but never had to go back to get it. I was so intrigued by her putting whatever it was on the ledge that once I actually went over and felt along the grimy little outset. I sheepishly followed my children into the hall, wiping the dust from my fingertips, and Sue Lin's eyes brimmed with amusement at me, her mouth smiling, her hands mischievously squared in front of her, and her thumbs caressed a solidness as the line of children swept into the room. I smiled too, because she was so pleased with having outwitted me. This seemed to be such a gay withdrawal that I let my worry die down. Better this manifestation than any number of other ones I could name. Someday, perhaps, I will learn to keep my mouth shut. I wish I had before that long afternoon, when we primary teachers worked together in a heavy cloud of ditto fumes. The acrid smell of India ink, drifting cigarette smoke, and the constant current of chatter. I let Alpha get me started on what I had to do with our behavior problems. She was all raunched up about the usual rowdy loudness of her boys and the eternal clack of her girls. And I, bless my stupidity, gave her Su Lin as an example of what should be our deepest concern, rather than the outbursts from the active ones. You mean she just sits and looks at nothing? Alpha's voice grated into her questioning tone. Well, I can't see anything, I admitted. But apparently she can. But that's having hallucinations. Her voice went up a notch. I read a book once. Yes. Marlene leaned across the desk to flick ashes into the ashtray. So we've all heard and heard and heard. Well, sniffed Alpha, it's better than never reading a book. We're waiting. Marlene leaked smoke from her nostrils. For the day when you read another book. This one must have been uncommonly long. Oh, I don't know. Alpha's forehead wrinkled with concentration. It was only about... Then she reddened and turned her face angrily away from Marlene. Apropos of our discussion, she said pointedly, it sounds to me like that child has a deep personality disturbance. Maybe even a psychotic... whatever. Her eyes glistened faintly as she turned the thought over. Oh, I don't know, I said, surprised into echoing her words at my sudden need to defend Su Lin. There's something about her. She doesn't have that apprehensive, hunched shoulder, don't hit me again air about her that so many withdrawn children have. And I thought achingly of one of mine from last year that Alpha had now was verbally bludgeoning back into silence after all my work with him. She seems too happy to have adjusted personality, only with this little odd plus. Well, I'd be worried if she were mine, said Alpha. I'm glad all my kids are so normal. She sighed complacently. I guess I really haven't anything to kick about. I seldom ever have problem children except wigglers and yackers, and a holler and a smack can straighten them out. Marlene caught my eye mockingly, tallying Alpha's class with me, and I turned away with a sigh. To be so happy. Well, I suppose the ignorance helps. You'd better do something about that girl, Alpha shrilled as she left the room. She'll probably get worse and worse as time goes on. Deteriorating, I think the book said. I had known Alpha a long time, and I thought I knew how much of her talk to discount. But I began to worry about Su Lin. Maybe this was a disturbance that was more fundamental than the usual run-of-the-mill I had met up with. Maybe a child can smile a soft, contented smile and still have little maggots of madness flourishing somewhere inside. Or, by gory, I said to myself defiantly, maybe she does have an anything box. Maybe she is looking at something precious. Who am I to say no to anything like that? An anything box. What could you see in an anything box? Heart's desire? I felt my own heart lurch, just a little. The next time Su Lin's hands curved, I breathed deeply to hold me in my chair. If it was her anything box, I wouldn't be able to see my heart's desire in it. Or would I? I propped my cheek upon my head and doodled aimlessly on my time schedule sheet. How on earth, I wondered, not for the first time, do I manage to get myself in these tangents? Then I felt a small presence at my elbow, and turned to meet Su Lin's wide eyes. "Teacher." The word was hardly more than a breath. "Yes?" I could tell that for some reason Su Lin was loving me dearly at that moment. Maybe because her group had gone into new books that morning. Maybe because I had noticed her new dress, the ruffles of which made her feel very feminine and lovable. Or maybe just because the late autumn sun lay so golden across her desk. Anyway, she was loving me to overflowing. And since, unlike most of the children, she had no casual hugs or easy, moist kisses, she was bringing her love to me in her encompassing hands. "See my box, teacher? It's my anything box." "Oh my," I said. "May I hold it?" After all I've held tenderly or apprehensively or bravely, tiger magic, live rattlesnakes, dragon's teeth, poor little dead butterflies, and 2 ears and a nose that dropped off of Sophie one cold morning, none of which I could see any more than I could the anything box. But I took the squareness from her carefully, and my tenderness showing in my fingers and my face, I received weight and substance and actuality. Almost I let slip out of my surprised fingers, but Su Lin's apprehensive breath helped me catch it, and I curved my fingers around the precious warmness and looked down, past a faint shimmering, down into Su Lin's anything box. I was running barefoot through the whispering grass. The swirl of my skirts caught the daisies as I rounded a gnarled apple tree on the corner. The warm wind lay upon each of my cheeks, and I chuckled in my ears. My heart outstripped my flying feet and melted with a rush of delight and warmness as his arms. I closed my eyes and swallowed hard. My palms tightened against the anything box. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It's wonderful, Su Lin. Where did you get it?" Her hands took it back hastily. "It's mine," she said defiantly. "It's mine." "Of course," I said. "Be careful now. Don't drop it." She smiled faintly as she sketched a motion to her pocket. "I won't." She patted the flat pocket on the way back to her seat. Next day she was afraid to look at me at first, for fear I might say something, or look something, or in some way remind her of what it must seem like a betrayal to her now. But after only, I smiled, my usual smile, with no added secret knowledge, she relaxed. A night or so later, when I leaned over my moon-drenched window sill and let the shadow of my hair hide my face from such exuberant glory, I remembered the anything box. Could I make one for myself? Could I square off this aching waiting, this outreaching, this silent cry inside me, and make it into an anything box? I freed my hands and brought them together, thumb to thumb, framing a part of the horizon's darkness between my upright forefingers. I stared into the empty square until my eyes watered. I sighed and laughed a little, and let my hands frame my face as I leaned out into the night. To have magic so near, to feel it tingle off my fingertips, and then to be so bound that I couldn't receive it. I turned away from the window, turning my back on brightness. It wasn't long after that Alpha succeeded in putting sharp points of worry back in my thoughts of Su Lin. We had ground duty together, and one morning we shivered while the kids ran themselves rosy in the crisp air. She sizzled into my ear. "Which one is it? The abnormal one, I mean." "I don't have any abnormal children," I said, my voice sharpening before the sentence ended, because I suddenly realized whom she meant. "Well, I call it abnormal to stare at nothing." You could almost taste the acid in her words. "Who is it?" "Sue Lynn," I said reluctantly. "She's playing on the bars now." Alpha surveyed the upside-down Sue Lynn, whose brief skirts were belled down from her bare pink legs and half covered her face as she swung from one of the bars by her knees. Alpha clutched her wizened blue hands together and breathed on them. "She looks normal enough," she said. "She is normal," I snapped. "Well, bite my head off," cried Alpha. "You're not the one that said she wasn't. Not me. Or is it not I? I can never remember. Not me, not I." The bell saved Alpha from a horrible end. I never knew a person so serenely unaware of essentials and so sensitive to trivia. But she had succeeded in making me worry about Sue Lynn again, and the worry exploded into distress a few days later. Sue Lynn came to school sleepy-eyed and quiet. She didn't finish any of her work, and she fell asleep during rest time. I cursed TV and drive-ins and assumed a night's sleep would put it right. But the next day, Sue Lynn burst into tears and slapped Davy clear off his chair. "Why, Sue Lynn!" I gathered Davy up in his astonishment and took Sue Lynn's hand. She jerked it away from me and flung herself at Davy again. She got 2 handfuls of his hair and had him out of my grasp before I knew it. She threw him bodily against the wall with a flip of her hands, then doubled up her fists and pressed them to her streaming eyes. In the shocked silence of the room, she stumbled over to isolation and seated herself back to the class, the little chair. She leaned her head into the corner and sobbed quietly in big gulping sobs. "What on earth goes on?" I asked the stupefied Davy, who sat spraggle-legged on the floor, fingering a detached tuft of hair. "What did you do?" "I only said robber daughter," said Davy. "It said so in the paper. My mama said her daddy's a robber. They'll put him in jail 'cause he robbed a gas station." His bewildered face was trying to decide whether or not to cry. Everything had happened so fast he didn't know yet if he was hurt. "It's not nice to call names," I said weakly. "Get back to your seat, and I will take care of Sue Lynn later." He got up and sat gingerly down in his chair, rubbing his roughed hair, wanting to make more of a production of the situation, but not knowing how. He twisted his face experimentally to see if he had tears available, and he had none. "Darn girls," he muttered, and tried to shake his fingers free of a wisp of his hair. I kept my eyes on Sue Lynn for the next half an hour as I busied myself with the class. Her sobs soon stopped, and her rigid shoulders relaxed. Her hands were softly in her lap, and I knew she was taking comfort from her anything box. We had our talk together later, but she was so completely sealed off from me by her misery that there was no communication between us. She sat quietly watching me as I talked, her hands trembling in her lap. It shakes the heart somehow to see the hands of a little child quiver like that. That afternoon I looked up from my reading group, startled as though by a cry, to catch Sue Lynn's frightened eyes. She looked around, bewildered, and then down at her hands again. Empty hands. She darted to the isolation corner and reached under the chair. She went back to her seat slowly, her hands squared to an unseen weight. For the first time, apparently, she had to go get the anything box. It troubled me with a vague unease for the rest of the afternoon. Though the days that followed while the trial hung fire, I had Sulin in attendance, bodily, but that was all. She sank into her anything box at every opportunity, and always, if she had put it away sometimes, she had to go back for it. She roused more and more reluctantly from these waking dreams, and there finally came a day when I had to shake her to awaken her. I went to her mother, but she couldn't or wouldn't understand me. Made me feel like I was a frivolous gossip monger taking her mind away from her husband, despite the fact I didn't even mention him. Or maybe because I didn't mention him. If she's being a bad girl, spank her, she firmly said, wearily shifting the weight of a whining baby from one hip to another, and pushing her tousled hair off her forehead. Whatever you do is all right by me. My warrior is all used up. I haven't got any left for the kids now. Well, Sulin's father was found guilty and sentenced to the state penitentiary. School was less than an hour old the next day when Davy came up, clumsily a tiptoe, braving my wrath for interrupting a reading group, and whispered hoarsely, "Sulin's asleep with her eyes open again, teacher." We went back to the table as Davy slid into his chair next to a completely unaware Sulin. He poked her with her finger. "I told you I'd tell on you." And before our horrified eyes, she toppled as rigidly as a doll sideways out of the chair. The thud of her landing relaxed. She lay limp on the green asphalt tile. A thin paper doll of a girl, one hand still clutched open around something. I pried her fingers loose and almost wept to feel enchantment dissolve under my heavy touch. I carried her down to the nurse's room, and we worked over her with wet towels and prayer. She finally opened her eyes. "Teacher," she whispered weakly. "Yes, Sulin?" I took her cold hands into mine. "Teacher, I almost got in my anything box." "No," I answered. "You couldn't. You're too big." "Daddy's there," she said, "and where we used to live." I took a long look away from her face. I hope it was genuine concern for her that prompted my next words. I hope it wasn't envy or the memory of the niggling nagging of Alpha's voice that put my firmness into my voice as I went on. "That's play-like," I said, "just for fun." Her hands jerked protestingly from mine. "Your anything box is just for fun. It's like Davy's cow pony that he keeps in his desk, or Soji's jet plane, or when the big bear chases all of you at recess. It's just for fun, for play, but it's not for real. You mustn't think it's for real. It's only play." "No," she denied. "No," she cried frantically, and hunching herself up on the cot, peering through the tear-swollen eyes, she scrabbed under the pillow and down beneath the rough blanket that covered her. "Where is it?" she cried. "Where is it? Give it back to me, teacher." She flung herself towards me and pulled open both my clenched hands. "Where did you put it? Where did you put it?" There is no anything box, I said flatly, trying to hold her to me and feeling my heart breaking along with hers. You took it, she sobbed. You took it away from me. And she wrenched herself out of my arms. Can't you give it back to her? Whispered the nurse. If it makes her feel so bad, whatever it is. It's just imagination, I said, almost sullenly. I can't give her back something that doesn't exist. Too young, I thought bitterly. Too young to learn that heart's desire is only play-like. Of course, the doctor found nothing wrong with her. Her mother dismissed the matter as a fainting spell, and Sulin came back to class the next day, thin and listless, staring blankly out the window, her hands palmed down on the desk. I swore by the pale hollow of her cheek that never, never again would I take any belief from anyone without replacing it with something better. What had I given Sulin? What had she better than I had taken from her? How did I know but that her anything box was on purpose to tide her over in rough spots on her life like this? And what now that I had taken it from her? Well, after a time she began to work again, and later to play. She came back to smiles, but not to laughter. She puttered along quite satisfactorily, except that she was a candle that had been blown out. The flame was gone wherever the brightness of belief goes. And she had no more sharing smiles for me, no overflowing love to bring me, and her shoulders shrugged subtly away from my touch. The one day I realized Sulin was searching our classroom, stealthily, casually. Day by day she was searching, covering every inch of the room. She went through every puzzle box, every lump of clay, every shelf and cupboard, every box and bag. Methodically she checked behind every row of books and in every child's desk, until finally, after almost a week, she had been through everything in the place except my desk. Then she began to materialize suddenly at my elbow every time I opened a drawer, and her eyes would pry quickly and sharply before I slid it shut again. But if I tried to intercept her, if I tried to catch her looks, they slid away. She had some legitimate errand that she had brought up to the vicinity of the desk. She believes it again, I thought hopefully. She won't accept the fact that her anything box is gone. But it is gone, I thought drearily. It's really for true gone. My head was heavied from troubled sleep, and sorrow was a weariness in all my movements. Waiting is sometimes a burden almost too heavy to carry. While my children hummed happily over their fun stuff, I brooded silently out the window until I managed to laugh at myself. It was a shaky laugh that threatened to dissolve into anything else, so I brisked back to my desk. As a good time as any to throw out useless things, I thought, and to see if I could find that colored chalk I put away so carefully. I plunged my hands into the wilderness of the bottom right-hand drawer of my desk. With a deep, huge accumulation of anything, just anything that might need a temporary hiding place. I knelt to pull out the leftover Jack Frost pictures, a broken-up bean shooter, a chewed-on red ribbon, a roll of cap gun ammunition, one striped sock, 6 number papers, a rubber dagger, a copy of the Gospel of St. Luke, a miniature coal shovel, patterns for jack-o'-lanterns, and pink plastic pelican. I retrieved my Irish linen hanky. I thought I lost for forever. And Soji's report card that she had told me solemnly had blown out of her hand and landed on a jet and broke the sound barrier so loud it busted all to flitters. Under the welter of miscellaneously, I felt a squareness. Oh, happy, I thought, this is where I put my colored chalk. I cascaded papers off both sides and lifting my hands and shook the box free. We were together outside. The world was an enchanting wilderness of white. The wind shouting softly through the windows, tapping wet, white fingers against a warm light. Inside, all the worry and waiting and apartness and loneliness were over and forgotten. Their hugeness dwindled by the comfort of a shoulder, the warmth of a collapsing hand. And nowhere was the fear of parting. Nowhere was the need to do without again. This was the happy ending. This was Su Lin's anything box. My heart racing, slowed as the dream faded, and rushed again at the realization I had it here, in my junk drawer. It had been there all this time. I stood up shakingly, concealing the invisible box in the flare of my skirts. I sat down and put the box carefully in the center of my desk, covering it with the tops of my palms, lest I should drown again in delight. I looked at Su Lin. She was finishing her fun paper, competently but unjoyously. Now would come her patient sitting with the quiet hands until I told her to do something else. Alpha would approve, and very possibly, I thought, Alpha would, for once in her limited life, be right. We may need hallucinations to keep us going. All of us but the Alphas. But when we go so far as to try and force ourselves physically into the never-never land of heart's desire. I remembered Su Lin's thin, rigid body toppling like a doll off its chair. Out of her deep need had she found or created? Who could tell? Something too dangerous for a child. I could so easily bring the brimming happiness back to her eyes. But at what a possible price? No, I had a duty to protect Su Lin. Only maturity. The maturity born of sorrow and loneliness of Su Lin was only the beginning to know. Could be trusted to use an anything box safely and wisely. My heart thudded as I began to move my hands, letting my palms slip down from the top to the shape of the sides of... I had moved them back again, before I really saw. And now I had learned almost to forget that glimpse of what heart's desire is like when won at the cost of another's heart. I sat there at the desk trembling, breathless, my palms moist, feeling as if I had been on a long journey away from the little schoolroom. Perhaps I had. Perhaps I had been shown all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Su Lin, I called, will you come up here when you're done? She nodded unsmilingly and snipped off the last paper from the edge of Mistress Mary's dress. Without another look at her handiwork, she carried the scissors safely to the scissors box, crumpled up the scraps of paper in her hand, and came up to the basket by the desk. I have something for you, Su Lin, I said, uncovering the box. Her eyes dropped to the desktop. She looked indifferently up at me. I did my fun paper already. Did you like it? Yes. It was a flat lie. Good, I lied right back. But look here. I squared my hands around the anything box. She took a deep breath, and the whole of her little body stiffened. "I found it," I said hastily, fearing anger. "I found it in the bottom drawer." She leaned her chest against my desk. Her hands caught tightly between her eyes, intent on the box. Her face white with aching want you see in a children's faces pressed against the windows on Christmas. "Can I have it?" she whispered. "It's yours," I said, holding it out. She leaned against her hands, her eyes searching my face. "Can I have it?" she asked again. "Yes." I was impatient with this anticlimactic, but her eyes flickered as she sensed my reservation before I had. "But you must never try to go into it again." "Okay," she said, the word coming out to a long, relieved sigh. "Okay, teacher." She took the box and tucked it lovingly into her small pocket. She turned from the desk and started back to her table. My mouth quirked with a small smile. It seemed to me that everything about her had suddenly turned upwards, even the ends of her straight taffy-colored hair. The subtle flame about her that made her Su Lin was there again. She scarcely touched the floor as she walked. I sighed heavily and traced on the desktop with my finger a probable size for an anything box. But what would Su Lin choose to see first? How like to drink after a drought would it seem to her? I was startled as a small figure materialized at my elbows. It was Su Lin, her fingers carefully squared before her. "Teacher," she said softly, all the flat emptiness gone from her voice. "Any time you want to take my anything box, just say so." I groped through my astonishment and incredulity for words. She couldn't possibly have time to look into the box yet. "Why, thank you, Su Lin," I managed. "Thanks a lot. I would very much like to borrow it sometime." "Would you like it now?" she asked, proffering it. No, thank you," I said, around the lump in my throat. "I've had a turn already. You go ahead." "Okay," she murmured. Then, "Teacher?" She shyly leaned up against me, her cheek on my shoulder. She looked up at me with her warm, unshuttered eyes. Then both arms were suddenly round my neck in a brief, awkward embrace. "Watch out," I whispered, laughing into the collar of her blue dress. "You'll lose it again." "No, I won't," she laughed back, patting the flat pocket of her dress. "Not ever. Not again." That was the story, The Anything Box, as written by Zeena Henderson.